Year 5 and 6, me, Mr. A, back with story time on this Monday morning, and we're going to carry on with chapter 14 of Over Sea Under Stone by Susan Cooper. Right. So, as the boys disappeared into the mouth of the cave, Jane had settled herself to lean against the lone standing rock, amongst the wet pillows of seaweed and the grey-green sweep of flat granite causeway round the cliff. She tucked the telescope case carefully under her arm. Even though she had always been with Simon when he was carrying it about, she felt a peculiar, unnerving sense of responsibility at the thought of what was inside. Gradually, she paid out the thin fishing line from the neatly wound wad in her hand. The pressure on it was uneven, as if inside the cave the boys were moving forward and then stopping every few moments. She had to concentrate to keep the line from either pulling too tight or dropping loose on the ground. It was very hot. The sun beat down over the towering grey cliff. And she felt the heat prickling along her skin. Even the rock she leant on was baked by the sun, and she could feel the warmth of it through her shirt on her back. Behind her, the water swished gently as it washed the edge of the uncovered rocks. There was no other sound anywhere. At the lonely foot of the headland, with the sea stretching all around, and without the line moving in her hands, Jane could have believed she was the only person in the world. The land and the grey house seemed very far away. She wondered, idly, if their parents had come back from Penzance yet, and what they would think when they found the house completely empty, with nothing to show where anyone had gone. She thought of the 3 figures they had seen striding out over Kamare Head, led by the frightening Mr. Hastings, black and long-legged like some giant insect. Instinctively, she looked up at the cliff, but there was no sound, no movement, only the great grey sweep of rock that leant over her in permanent, unmoving menace, with the green cap of grass on the headland at the top, 200 feet above. And then Great Uncle Merry followed them into her mind. Where was he? Where had he gone this time? What, so near the end of the quest, could possibly have been important enough to take him away? Never for one moment did Jane think that he could have come to any harm, or have been captured by the enemy. She remembered too clearly, with utter confidence, with which Great Uncle Merry had swept her into his arms on that midnight headland. They dare not follow if I am here. I wish you were here now, Jane said aloud, shivering a little in spite of the hot, still air. She was not happy with Simon and Barney deep in the darkness, where anything might be lurking, where they might get lost and never get out, where the roof might fall in. Great Uncle Merry would have made sure that nothing like that could happen. Jane looked at her watch. It was 12 minutes past 5, and still the line in her hands was moving slowly and irregularly into the cave. She gave 2 strong, deliberate tugs on the line. After a pause, she felt it move twice in reply, but faintly. The line was 2/3 unwound. She wished she had measured it as she let it go. Time dragged by. Still the line pulled insistently out of her hand, moving into the dark entrance more slowly now. The sun blazed down immovable out of the empty blue sky, and a small breeze sprang up from nowhere to lift the edges of Jane's long, loose hair. She leant across against the rock and let her senses drift, feeling the heat of the sun on her skin, breathing the sea smell of the wet rocks and seaweed, and listening to the gentle lap-lap of the sea. Then, in a kind of sleepy daze, with only her fingers awake, she became aware that the sound of the sea had changed. She jerked to her feet and swung around. To her horror, the piles of seaweed nearest the sea were swaying up and down in a swell that had not been there before. Waves were washing over what had been the edge of the rocks, nearer her, she thought, than they had been. The tide was on the turn. Jane felt panic begin to rise within her. The last few loops of the line were loose in her hand now. The boys must be an alarming way inside the cave. She took firm hold of the line, winding part of the slack round her hand and going right up to the dark mouth of the cave, and jerked it hard, 1, 2, 3 times. Nothing happened. She waited, listening to the regular swash of the waves creeping in. Then, just as tears of fright were beginning to prickle in her eyes, she felt the answering signal. 3 faint tugs on the line pulling at her hand. Almost at once the strain lessened, and the line began to fall slack. Jane let out a great breath of relief. The line came towards her as she pulled at it, slowly at first and then more easily, faster than she had paid it out. Then at last, Simon and Barney, blinking at the daylight behind hands raised to shield their eyes, came stumbling out of the narrow entrance of the cave. "Hello," Simon said foolishly, sounding dazed. His matches had run out full 5 minutes before they reached the light, and the last part of the way had been a nightmare journey in the pitch dark, walking blind and trusting the feel of the line to tell them that the way ahead was clear. He had made Barney let him go first. All the time he felt that every next step might bring him crashing against rock or face to face in the dark with some nameless thing, and he would not have been surprised when they emerged to find that all his hair had turned white. Jane only looked at him with a small wry grin and said as he had, "Hello." "Look," Barney said, and held up the grail. Jane felt her grin widen with delight. "Then we've beaten them! We've got it! Gosh, I wish Gummery were here. I think it's made of gold." Barney rubbed at the metal. Out in the sunlight, the grail seemed far less magical than in the mysterious darkness of the cave, but a bright yellow gleam showed here and there through the dirt on its side. "There's a sort of pattern scratched all over it too," he said, "but you can't see properly without cleaning it up. It's terribly ancient. But what does it mean? I mean, everyone's trying like mad to get hold of it because it can tell them something, but when you look at it, there doesn't seem to be anything it could possibly tell anyone. Unless that pattern's some sort of message." "The manuscript," Simon said. "Oh gosh, yes." Barney took the small, heavy lead tube from the cup and showed Jane the manuscript inside. "This was wedged in the grail. It must follow on from where our manuscript leaves off. I bet it's tremendously important. I bet it explains everything. But it breaks up almost as soon as you look at it." He carefully fitted the cap back on the tube. "We've got to get it home safely," Simon said. "I wonder if there's room... Wait a minute." He took the telescope case from under Jane's arm and unscrewed it. Their own familiar manuscript stood up from the lower half, fitting it closely. Simon took the dark leaden cylinder and dropped it carefully inside the centre of the parchment in the telescope case. "There. Got a hanky, Jane?" Jane took her handkerchief from her shirt pocket. "What for?" "Like that," Simon said, fitting the handkerchief in a tight ball inside the top of the parchment roll. "It'll keep the new one steady. We'll have to run if we're going to get off before the tide catches up with us, and it'll get bounced about a lot." Automatically, Jane and Barney turned to look again at the sea, and at exactly the same moment each of them gasped, with a noise of pure strangled fright. Simon had bent his head to screw the two halves of the case back together. He looked up quickly. The waves were lifting the seaweed now within 6 feet of where they stood, but that was not what was wrong. Jane and Barney, arrested in mid-movement, were looking further out to sea. For a moment, the one jutting rock obscured Simon's view. Then he too saw a tall sweeping lines of the yacht Lady Mary, under full sail, come round the end of the headland towards them, and he too saw the tall dark figure standing in the bow with one arm raised, pointing. "Come on, quick!" He grabbed at Barney and Jane as they stood motionless with shock, and pushed them ahead of him. All right, I'm going to leave it there as we near the conclusion. Not long left now, so I'll be back again tomorrow. Predictions. Wonder what your predictions are. My prediction is they're going to get caught, and Withers and Mr. Hastings, they're going to take the Grail and think they've won. But really, the important thing is what's in the manuscript, and that's the next clue to discovering something bigger, and that's what they'll get. And I don't remember because I read this when I was like 10. So anyway, back again tomorrow. Meantime, take care and have a great day.